Mr. Secretary, join me up here. We got you even a fresh glass of water, so I appreciate that very much. Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center, sir.
Good to see you.
So everyone says that our guest needs no introduction and then goes forward to introduce him, and that's what I, of course, will do as well, but I'm going to keep it short. I think, as you all know, Secretary Wilbur Ross is the 39th Secretary of the Department of Commerce. He was sworn in February of this year. He was recently, and for quite a few years, the Chairman and Chief Strategy Officer, I like the fact you hung on to that, of the W.L. Ross Company. Secretary has restructured probably over $400 billion of assets from just about every industry you've ever heard of, and a few you probably have not. Chairman or a lead director of, and I'm just shocked, there's over 100 companies in over 20 different countries. The only person elected to both the Private Equity Hall of Fame and the Turnaround Management Hall of Fame, neither of which I've had the chance to visit, but I look forward to that opportunity. And finally, Secretary Ross, in his private capacity, is a very generous philanthropist. And now he's also a public servant with the trust and, I think, clear devotion of the President of the United States. And we are delighted and honored to have you here. I believe this is the first time you've had a chance to talk about the NAFTA issue since the formal letter of renegotiation was sent over to the Congress. And I just maybe ask you just to start off by situating just most broadly, what are the main concerns that have animated this discussion? At the end of the day, what is the President really trying to accomplish through this renegotiation?
Well, I think it's quite a variety of things. The first guiding principle, though, is do no harm, because there were some things that were achieved under NAFTA and under other trade agreements. So the first rule is do no harm. Then the second rule of thumb will be there were a number of concessions the NAFTA countries made in connection with the TPP. And so we would view those as sort of a starting point for discussion. But think about it. It's an old agreement. It didn't address digital economy, really didn't address much in the way of services, especially didn't address much in the way of financial services. So there are some big holes in it. Beyond that, there are issues like intellectual property rights, regulatory practices, customs procedures, sanitary and phytosanitary regulations, labor issues, environmental issues, issues about dealing with the SMEs, and most of all, enforcement, because there's not much point going to all the trouble to make an elaborate trade agreement if you're not going to enforce it and really get the benefits of it that you bargained for.
So that's a great list, and we're gonna have a chance to dig into a lot of that. I think a lot of people in this room and others are really comforted by your initial statement, which is the goal at first, of course, Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. The President made some people nervous a few weeks ago. I think the President was elected on a mandate to shake things up, and NAFTA certainly is among the things that was being shaken. What can you share with us about that kind of commitment to do no harm? I mean, can people now take it as a given that the idea that we're going to tear up the agreement is no longer part of the conversation?
Well, the President never announced that he was going to tear up the agreement. That was speculation mostly in the media. So I don't think you can hang that on him or for that matter on me.
Fair. Of the list that you mentioned, you talked about a little bit some of the TPP concessions. Where do you see some of this kind of lower-hanging fruit that could be the engine of that negotiation? Where would you have a lot of places you could start? What are the couple of places you might pick first?
Well, the easiest ones will be the ones that weren't contained in the original agreement, because that's new territory. That's not anybody giving up anything. And by and large, those should be the easiest issues to get done. But they're important because one of our objectives will be to try to incorporate in NAFTA kind of basic principles that we would like to have followed in subsequent free trade agreements, rather than starting each one with a blank sheet of paper.
So say a little more about those principles. I think we had a conversation before you joined about the importance of NAFTA as the first step in this much larger global conversation. What are some of the predicates that you think are going to be critical in the renegotiation?
Well, one of our big objectives is to reduce our trade deficit. And there's lots of ways of doing that. The way that we think is the easiest, not just for these two countries, but for anybody with whom we partner, would be to divert to U.S. sources products they're already buying from abroad, but from a country other than the U.S. For example, some of the agricultural products they buy come from Brazil. Well, they could just as well give us a little better market share than we have now. And that's just one example of many.
So the issue of deficits is obviously significant in the administration's policy. The department has held some public hearings and discussion on this. Could you unpack that a little more? I mean, are all deficits created equal? Are there good deficits, medium deficits, and bad deficits? I mean, you know, it means a lot of things to a lot of different people.
I don't know if I'd class them good, medium, and bad. I think there's no question that trade surpluses are more beneficial to a country than trade deficits. But within deficits, there are two categories that I would call. One is what I would call blameless deficits. For example, we are not yet self-sufficient in energy. So naturally, we're going to have something of a deficit caused by importation of hydrocarbons. So, and that's an important consideration because relative to Canada, that's more than our entire deficit comes from both hydrocarbons and electrical energy that they export to the U.S. I don't call that blameful exports. What is blameful are things that are subsidized or are not with a level playing field or come from some other inappropriate source of behavior rather than the natural course.
Talk a little bit about the process of renegotiation. One key question is which institution of government actually is going to be driving the ship. Obviously, the president is going to be initiating and has initiated the conversation. To what extent do you think it's possible that these changes could be done essentially within the scope of the existing statute? To what extent do you think congressional action is necessary? Is there a possibility of a hybrid of those two approaches?
Oh, by and large, any big change would need congressional approval. And that's why we labored so hard to deal with the Trade Promotion Authority, the so-called fast-track approach. And that has some procedural steps that still have to be followed. We did send the so-called 90-day letter on May 18th, and so that will mature on August 16th, and that's when the formal negotiations can first get going. There's also a way station in between. In mid-July, 30 days before the end, we have to have a very full discussion with the congressional committees about more detailed objectives than we have put forward so far.
So obviously that would be the formal negotiations. There have been quite a few informal conversations happening, I think, between the three countries. How productive have those been, and what can you share with us about the tenor and focus of those conversations?
Well, those have been trying to clear away some long-standing issues between the countries. In the case of Mexico, sugar is a principal one. And in the case of Canada, there are really two, the softwood lumber and the dairy products.
And do you imagine that those are going to be solved within the context of this renegotiation, or do you think they'll be addressed kind of as the runway leading up to the negotiation?
Well, we've been negotiating on both for quite some little while. There are many years in the making, so whether we can get them finished in the remaining few days before formal NAFTA, I don't know. In both of them, if there is no formal negotiated solution, they are the outgrowth of trade cases, so we will impose the countervailing duties and anti-dumping in those cases if there is no negotiated settlement.
So I want to ask also about the process of kind of the whole of government question here, because the trade focus and commerce obviously has the lead here. But there are significant national security questions. Having, obviously close friends on both of our borders matters a whole lot. There are questions about immigration enforcement. What has been the process through which you and your peers have been having this conversation?
Well, the security issues are pretty clearly defined. They are not mainly the province of trade negotiation.
Sure. Homeland
Security has spent quite a bit of time with their Mexican counterparts and with their Canadian counterparts, for that matter. So there may well be some issues incorporated into NAFTA, but those are sort of separate discussions.
But you think it is, at least from a political standpoint, possible that there'll be border security conversations maturing in that same time frame that could come together as a package?
Well, I think there are border security discussions underway all the time.
Fair. So I want to ask a little bit about beyond just the U.S.-Mexico and U.S.-Canada conversation. Trade has been in the press in the last couple of days and deficits in the context of our relationship with Germany. And I think I'd be curious in your sense about how specific are the conversations to Canada and Mexico? Do you think these are really the same themes that are at influence in our conversations with Chancellor Merkel and others?
Well, first of all, we cannot be negotiating separately with Germany. Germany is a member state of the European Union. All trade negotiations are handled at the European Commission level. So while there are differences in our trade relationship with the various member states, it's not possible to have separate negotiations. So that's not on the table. We do have, however, an overall trade deficit with the EU. So in that sense, it gets subsumed within it.
I want to turn back to, I think, a broader question about the importance of NAFTA, not just in the immediate economy, but just to overall kind of the psyche of the nation. I think the president spoke pretty passionately during the campaign about people who he felt had been left behind, that sense that the American dream had really become less available to so many people in this country. And unfair trade, as kind of emblematic in the conversation around NAFTA, has become, I think, a symbol of that larger conversation. I wonder if you agree with that premise. And then my second question is, the expectations that we are creating about the influence that improving NAFTA can have on that broader conversation. Are we setting people up for unrealistic aspirations?
Well, not all the unemployment problems and not all the joblessness problems are a result of NAFTA or any other trade agreement. Some of them are due simply to increased automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, things of that sort. And those are problems that will recur on an even broader basis in the years into the future. So no one is saying that this is the silver bullet that solves every problem for the country. But it's one of the ones where we have some degree of control, and therefore it's one that very much should be addressed.
Do you have a ability to think a little bit about the timing? I think one of the questions that a number of people have raised is the fact that there's a very significant election process happening in Mexico, and obviously one of the candidates does not have the same kind of affinity for the U.S. capitalist system as the other. What's the sensitivity to having this conversation happening right in the middle of that domestic political challenge?
Well, we had hoped to have it even a little earlier, but it took longer to get Congress to the point of the 90-day letter. So it would have been preferable to have it even earlier so that it was a little further separated from the Mexican election. But there have also been elections. British Columbia just had an election, and some of our trade controversies are very much with British Columbia. So there's always somebody having an election. And my guess is that we probably have the best window from now until December or early January. Their election is mid-year, and so the closer you get to it, the more complicated it will become, particularly in terms of getting the Mexican congressional approval. But we also shouldn't forget two other things. The Trade Promotion Authority expires July of next year, and we too have elections, the midterm elections, and those will undoubtedly have some impact on congressional views.
On the question of Congress, I'm not asking you to name any names, but how engaged, how effective have individual members been in expressing their concerns? Do you feel like there's a constructive, deliberative effort underway there that's going to be...
Concerns about what?
Just about how their aspirations for how you make the treaties agreement more effective, their concerns about ways in which changes could undermine their districts. I mean, are you hearing a lot from members of Congress?
Oh, we hear a lot from members of Congress all the time. On a variety of topics, on individual trade issues, on the individual problems of individual companies. I hear from them all the time. They're not at all shy about expressing their views.
But you would say that not being shy and being effective are not necessarily the same thing. You think that you're getting good information from members?
At the end of the day, people will hopefully have a new agreement to look at, and you can judge then what's been effective, what hasn't been effective, and have we overall done an effective job.
A couple of other questions before I let you go, and I know you have to be across town soon. The mere act of change creates uncertainty. Right? You can't have progress without uncertainty, but there has been quite a bit of anxiety, and you've seen a lot of market movement around different stages of this process. When the president was, people thought there might be kind of ending the agreement as a step in. You saw a reduction in some key commodity prices when we moved forward. So how possible is it to put boundaries around the negotiation? I mean, I think you laid out a pretty clear framework, but there's this existential imagination still, fair or not, that the U.S. might walk away from this agreement. Can the administration say more explicitly that these are the boundaries of the conversation and these are the components that you think are meaningful and should be sustained?
Well, I think the last thing you want to do in any negotiation is to announce in advance your ending point, because then it will become the starting point.
But I wouldn't say the outcome, but there is you could talk about what's on the table for discussion. And again, I think the list you laid out at the very outset. Well,
just did.
And I guess now that's important new information for the country, which we appreciate very much. News breaking here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Mr. Secretary, I guess I want to just end by giving you an opportunity to talk a little bit about where you see other opportunities to address the president's ambitions for growth. Because I think you mentioned NAFTA is a component of it, but what are the other aspirations you have at Commerce and the other places which will provide that kind of package?
Sure.
I think the 3%, 4%, 5% growth is something that would make us all very, very happy.
Well, trade is one component. Regulatory reform, which we've also been helping out on, is a very, very major one, maybe in some ways the most major one. Infrastructure is another important one, and not least of all, tax policy and energy policy. All of those are essential components of getting to a more rapid, more robust growth rate.
All right, Mr. Secretary. Well, you have a big job ahead of you. I'm going to let you go get back at it, but we really are greatly appreciative that you joined us this afternoon, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Good to see you.
We have a 10-year lease on the building, so I welcome you all to spend some time and interact with one another, but we are going to try to let the Secretary exit stage left. So thank you, sir.